When it gets close to time, if you're still talking, I'll
Yeah.
do that.
I tend to get wrapped up in these things, so you have to calm me down.
All right, go for
Get
it.
too
You
close.
wanted to know how many would be here, and I said, well, maybe 20. I was pretty
I
close.
brought 25. So I hope this will be enough. I'll pass them around in each direction. Let me give you one way back in the corner here. Let's see. I hope this will be enough. If not, somebody can have my copy when I get through with it, and you can give me your email address, and I will send you a copy
in.
when I get back to Knoxville. I want to.
Yeah, get a drink and then bring one of these chairs up to the table. Bye.
I want to thank John Cobb for inviting me. I hope you don't mind if I stand up for my presentation. My mouth seems to work better when I'm standing than when I'm sitting, so I'm going to do it this way, if you don't mind. I'd be willing to bet that I've known John Cobb longer than anybody else in this room. My first 2 years at Emory University was spent at Emory Junior College in Oxford, Georgia, and John tells me that he attended Emory at Oxford for a time, but I did not know him for the first 2 years that I was at Emory. When I became a junior, I moved on to Big Emory, as we called it, in Atlanta, and I first got acquainted with him sometime during 1954-55. Has anybody known John Cobb longer than 1954-55? I think I won that bet.
You would.
Don't try it though in Pilgrim Place at lunch, or you won't make it.
I won't. I've been involved with process theology and philosophy for a very long time. Actually, my first exposure to process thought was not to John Cobb and Charles Hartshorne. It was to Nels Ferret, who was Frederick Ferret's father. Most of you, I suspect, know Frederick Ferret. For 3 summers during my college experience, I worked at Lake Junaluska, North Carolina. And I had an opportunity at Lake Junaluska to hear Nels Ferret at least 3 times, I think. That was before the authorities at Lake Junaluska decided that he was too liberal to invite again and refused to continue to invite him to speak at Lake Junaluska. But he was my first exposure to process theology, and I read a couple of his books even before I moved on to Big Emory and I met John Cobb. My senior year at Emory, some very momentous things happened. One of them was that I took John Cobb's course in philosophical ethics. Now, John was a faculty member in the Canada School of Theology, but occasionally they let him teach a philosophy course. And by the grace of God, I lucked up on his course in philosophical ethics. So John is a person who got me hooked on ethical theory and axiology more generally, and I've been hooked on it ever since. Something really remarkable happened at the end of that course. Now, the last time I saw John was several decades ago when he was giving some talks at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And I told him about this, and he said he didn't remember it, but I remember it. Here's what happened. And it really did happen. My memory's not this bad.
Mine is bad.
I was the very last person to turn in my final exam paper. And when I turned it in to John, he said, "Rem, how would you like to go home with me this afternoon and grade these final exams for me?" And believe it or not, I did. That was the most exhilarating experience I ever had grading papers. By the time I got through teaching, I was tired of it, but that time it was just an incredible experience, especially to do it for John Cobb.
I do expect students from a lot.
Something else very important happened during my senior year in college. That was Charles Hartshorn's first year at Emory. And he'd come there, of course, from the University of Chicago. I took 2 courses from Hartshorn during that year. I took his philosophy of religion course, and I took a graduate course in Peirce and Whitehead. And of course, Peirce and Whitehead have been tremendous influences on my philosophical thinking all of these years. Peirce's fallibilism is something that I have subscribed to with intellectual humility through all the years, and of course, Whitehead's thinking about God and many, many other subjects have had a tremendous influence on me. Most of you probably know one other graduate student who was in that course, that graduate course in Peirce and Whitehead, and that's Lewis Ford. Lewis Ford took a master's degree at Emory during Hartshorn's first year there. And then after that, he moved on to Yale Philosophy Department. And I moved on that same year to Yale Divinity School. And when I got to Yale Divinity School, I studied the catalog very carefully and found all the loopholes that permitted me to take courses in the Graduate School of Philosophy. So I ended up taking almost a year's worth for that Divinity School degree in the Graduate School of Philosophy. And of course, Lewis Ford and I continued to take courses and see one another periodically at Yale after that. And we've been great friends, and we still correspond occasionally whenever an idea strikes us that we want to play off of one another. After I finished Yale Divinity School, I was all set to go back to philosophy, I was all set to go for a PhD in philosophy at Yale. But I decided that I would go back to Emory for my PhD in philosophy. Charles Hartshorn was still there. After 3 years at Yale Divinity School, I decided that he knew more about God than all the Divinity School professors at Yale put together. So I went back there. There was also a very beautiful Georgia peach of a girl involved in that decision to go back to Emory. I won't say anything more about that, except that this past August, we celebrated our 51st wedding anniversary. I want to say one more thing by way of preliminaries before I get to the main topics that I want to deal with today. When I got to Yale, I found that everybody there, faculty, graduate students, everybody I ran across pronounced Hartshorn's name as Hartshorn. And after 3 years there, I guess I picked up the habit. I guess I decided that this was Yale University, and I was just a local hick from a small town in Georgia. And if that's the way they pronounced it at Yale, it had to be right. Charles Hartshorn himself notwithstanding to the contrary. Well, when I got back to Emory, we had a social gathering, faculty, graduate students. I think it was at Hartshorn's house. And in the hearing of Dorothy Hartshorn, I pronounced the name Hartshorn. Now let me tell you folks, that is one mistake you don't ever want to make here or hereafter. She marched over to me and said, "Young man, that is not right. The name," she said, "is not the name of a shorned hart. It is the name of a horned hart." And after that, I've never forgotten how to pronounce that name. My talk is going to be a little bit more philosophical than the previous one. I guess you could expect that from a philosopher. What I want to do is introduce to you certain basic questions that I think that any well-developed theory of process ethics should try to answer. Now, I suspect that my outline here is lengthier than we will have time to get through in the time that I've been allowed. We'll go as far as we can with it, and I invite you to jump into the discussion anytime you have something to say. Don't just wait until the end if you want to interrupt and ask a question or make a comment. But one of the first and foremost questions that I think we need to answer is what is process ethics? That is to say, what is distinctive about it? What are we as process ethicists doing that any well-trained philosopher in ethics would not be doing? It seems to me that there are several possible answers to that, or several possible approaches to it. I want to suggest a couple and just invite you to think with me about this for a moment. But it seems to me that thinking within the process tradition about anything, whether it be ethics or metaphysics or what have you, is sort of like thinking within the Christian tradition about anything. What makes Christian thinkers Christian thinkers? What makes process thinkers process thinkers? Well, for one thing, we can trace at least some of our thoughts and ideas and beliefs back to the founding fathers. Now, of course, the founding fathers in Christianity would be Jesus and all the guys you read about in the New Testament, and gals too. And of course, there were a lot of Old Testament prophets who came along before that, and so it is, I think, with process thinking. There are two fundamental founding fathers, I think, for process thinking, and that is Whitehead and Hartshorne. And we know that there were Old Testament prophets like Peirce and James and many, many others that we could mention. But I think part of being part of doing process ethics is being able to trace at least some of our fundamental thoughts and beliefs and ideas back to Hartshorne and Whitehead. But I think there's another aspect of being a part of a tradition of Christian thinking, and that is we belong to the tradition. That is, Christian thinking didn't stop just with the New Testament. It's been going on for many, many centuries, and many new currents have been flowing into the stream of that tradition. We all know how all of the ideas of the Greek philosophers flowed into the tradition of Christian thought over the first few centuries and continuing thereafter. And process tradition, the process tradition has still been developing after Whitehead and Hartshorne. Central figure, of course, is John Cobb and many, many others for that matter. But new ideas have come in and been assimilated. And so it is, I think, with process thought and process ethics. It was mentioned that I have done a book on process ethics that's going to be published in your series. When John invited me to participate in this conference, it was fairly early in the year. And I thought, well, I ought to sit down and write up about 10 pages or so and try to figure out exactly where I stand on certain issues in process ethics, clarify my own thinking about that. Well, it didn't stop after 10 pages. it just kept going and going and going, and finally, a small book has emerged from that. But what does the axiological part of that mean? My own thinking in value theory has been influenced greatly by many, many streams of thought. One of them, of course, is the process tradition, but the other is a tradition of formal axiology developed by Robert S. Hartman. Most of you have probably never heard of Robert S. Hartman. Read my book. You can learn something about Robert S. Hartman. But Robert S. Hartman was a senior colleague of mine at University of Tennessee during the late 1960s and early 1970s before he died very, very prematurely in 1973. While I was there, I had the wisdom to recognize that this was someone that I could learn a lot from, and I sat in on his graduate courses and have been continuing to work with him and with his ideas. And many of his former colleagues and students have established the Robert S. Hartman Institute, and it's an ongoing concern. You can find us on the internet. And Katie Connor, sitting back in the corner over there, she introduced herself earlier, is now the president of the Robert S. Hartman Institute. So I hope that you'll take advantage of your opportunity to get better acquainted with her. I'm not going to have time to say much about Robert S. Hartman during this presentation. I'm really going to be working mainly with Whitehead and Whiteheadian ideas. Okay, now once we've decided what process ethics is, it seems to me that there are certain fundamental questions that any process ethics should try to answer. And beginning with my outline here with G.E. Moore's three questions of ethics. What is the meaning of good? What things are good? And what ought I or we to do? I think ethics has to do with goodness, and it has to do with duty. I'm not going to do much today with the problem of giving a general definition of good, although I work with that in my book, and I'm deeply indebted to Robert S. Hartman for that. Obviously, we use the word good outside of moral context. So not all uses of the word good are moral uses of the word good. John Cobb's old car is a wonderful car. It's a good car, but we're not making a moral judgment when we say that John Cobb has a good car. In morality, I think we're primarily concerned with a species of goodness, or a dimension of goodness, as Robert Hartman called it, intrinsic goodness. What things are good? What is the meaning of good? I think I want to work mainly with good in the intrinsic sense. Now, there's fairly general and non-process agreement about what intrinsic good means. Intrinsically good things are things that are good or valuable in and of themselves. They're ends in themselves. They're valuable for their own sake. Where I think process thought needs to get into the act is with G.E. Moore's second question of ethics. What things are intrinsically good? I'm going to construe G.E. Moore's question as meaning what things are intrinsically good. Now, Moore himself gave an interesting answer to that. He said what's intrinsically good are the pleasures of human intercourse and the enjoyment of beauty. Now, I think we have to construe the pleasures of human intercourse non-literally, as meaning the enjoyment of human fellowship and companionship, the positive valuation of human beings as such, for their own sake, perhaps, although I think he did not take it quite that far. But how do process thinkers answer the question of what things are intrinsically good? Well, in trying to figure out, clarify my own thinking about the process ethics, I decided, well, I need to go back and read the books that have been written on process ethics and the books in which process ethics have been discussed, and try to find an answer to that. And I found basically two answers. One of them was beauty is intrinsically good, and the other one was the individuals are intrinsically good. Given that dichotomy, I decided, well, maybe I need to go back to the founding fathers and look at Whitehead and see what Whitehead had to say on the topic of intrinsic goodness. So I worked through Whitehead, and I tried to find passages in which he referred to intrinsic worth, intrinsic goodness, ends in themselves, valuable for their own sake, that sort of thing. And some of the major results are near the top of the first page here that I found. I'm not going to read those results with you. I'm just going to try to summarize them very briefly for you. It seems to me that Whitehead's own position was that that individuals who are capable of self-enjoyment, self-valuation, valuation of others, such things are intrinsically good. Now, that didn't prove to be the end of the road, because it turns out that in process thought, there are some serious ambiguities about what counts as an individual. Whitehead, as probably all of you know, was critical of established conventional moral codes. He thought that they were very defective in many ways, and in need of great improvement, and they tended toward a dogmatism. I mean, established moral codes are people seem to relate to them as if they were handed down from on high and can never be changed. Well, if you look at the way people live and the moralities by which people live, I think we can easily see that a lot of them need a bit of correcting. As far as established and practiced moral codes are concerned, a lot of them assign second-rate, third-rate, or no-rate citizenship to huge classes of people. Now, from an ideal standpoint of morality, that's immoral. But as far as established, practicing moral codes, the codes by which people live and think they're being moral, there they are. That's life. Whitehead suggested that there are two ultimate values to which we can appeal in trying to correct the deficiencies of established moral codes. And one of them is the value of individuals, and the other is harmony, by which I think he meant beauty. But there's this lingering problem of what counts as an individual in process thought. And I give you two possible answers. The most obvious answer, and the one that I think Whitehead took most seriously, was actual occasions. Now, actual occasions are very fleeting. Hartshorne thought that actual occasions, that is, brief moments of time that have duration. Time comes in pulsations of actuality, which he called actual occasions, these brief moments of time. Hartman thought that on the human level, the level of human consciousness, these endure for about 1/10 of a second. I suspect that most process thinkers pretty much agree with that or assume that something like that is the case. Now, during that 1/10 of a second, an awful lot goes on. A given actual occasion will inherit data or information from its predecessors. It will inherit a set of ideals, subjective aims, possibilities from God. It will have to decide among those possibilities, those ideals, those ideal aims. It does decide what it wants to become, given those ideal possibilities that are before it. And then it finishes itself. It completes itself and hurls what it can of itself at the future. Now, that's what Whitehead meant, I think, by an individual, by individuals having intrinsic worth. There's another sense of individuals in process thinking and even in Whitehead, but certainly so in process ethics. And the contrast is whole persons. Now, there's a Whiteheadian account of what counts as a whole person. Whole persons for Whitehead, he almost never calls them individuals. They are societies. We are societies. Incredibly complex societies of individuals. Our bodies are societies of organs and cells and molecules and atoms and so on, all of which have a temporal dimension and not just a spatial dimension. But within human bodies and animal bodies, there's a dominant society of actual occasions, the stream of consciousness, William James calls it. Whitehead called it the soul. But is the soul an individual? Are whole people individuals? When we talk about loving our neighbors as ourselves, when we listen to Kant's words, we should always treat persons as ends in themselves and never merely as means. I suspect all of us feel the attraction and importance of that ethical principle. Now, I think Kant really screwed it up, but I'm wondering if Whitehead really screwed it up too, if we try to apply that to Whitehead's thought. Brian Henning says in his wonderful book on process ethics that what process ethics needs is an understanding of macroscopic human beings that does full justice to their unity. Macroscopic human beings as we know them. Enduring human beings, as opposed to these fleeting actual occasions. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, fine. I hope that I'm not misquoting, misrepresenting what you have to say, but I do give you Brian's words for it right near the bottom of the first page. I think process ethics needs an understanding of whole persons as individuals that are intrinsically good and that are something more than the mere sum of the individual actual occasions within our stream of consciousness and within our bodies, because we are very definitely embodied souls throughout. Can we develop, here's a challenge, I think, for process ethics. Can we develop an understanding of the metaphysics of what it is to be a whole person that allows people to be organic wholes. Something more than the sum of their parts. Something greater in value than the mere sum of their parts. I hope we can do this. Now, this distinction between two senses of the individual in process thought, and I think process ethicists tend to slide back and forth between the two and assume that what is true of one is true of the other. That is not at all obvious. But I give you three questions here that I think are ethical questions that are raised by this dual sense of individuality in process thought. One of them is, are only actual occasions intrinsically good? Or are whole persons as something greater than the sum of our parts, of our temporal actual occasion parts? Are we intrinsically good? When we hear, love your neighbor as yourself, aren't we thinking about whole persons? When we hear, we should always treat persons as ends in themselves and never merely as means, aren't we thinking about whole persons somehow? All right, now there's another important question, and Brian deals with this question. Brian and Whitehead deal in different ways with this question, I think. Do we ever have any moral duties to actual occasions? Now remember, actual occasions are gone just like that, quicker than that. There were several actual occasions while I was snapping my fingers. I use some quotes from Whitehead there, where it seems to me Whitehead does say we have duties to actual occasions. At least that's his language for it. Of course, language can be interpreted in many different ways, and Whitehead can be interpreted in many different ways, pretty obviously. Now, Brian says, we don't have any duties to actual occasions. They're gone too quickly. We can't get a handle on them. We have moral duties to whole persons as enduring individuals, but not to actual occasions as such. And then there's a third ethical question, and that is, are only actual occasions moral agents? I think Whitehead's position on this is very clear. Yes, I give you the quote there, and I give you an additional reference. The only agents in the universe are actual occasions. The only thing that's really real is actual occasions. Do we really want to agree with Whitehead, or do we need and want to move beyond Whitehead in some ways for ethical purposes in order to handle questions like this? All right, let me see where I am in this handout. Okay. Now, before I can go further with Whitehead, I have to introduce some distinctions between different kinds of goodness. To some extent, I'm indebted to Robert S. Hartman here. Hartman said there are three kinds or dimensions of goodness. Intrinsic goodness, what things are intrinsically good. I think whole persons and animals, we must get animals into the discussion here, and I think before the day is over, we'll be getting them in. Whole, unique, conscious, enduring individuals are intrinsically good. But intrinsic goodness is one of several kinds of goodness. The other obvious kind that I think all philosophers are acquainted with is extrinsic goodness. Extrinsically good things are means to ends. Kant said, always treat persons as ends in themselves and never merely as means. Well, that recognizes that some things are good as means. So the second kind of goodness is extrinsic goodness. Extrinsically good things are useful to us in getting something else besides themselves, something else beyond themselves. I think the counterpart for this in process thought is the concept of aggregates. Now, aggregates are things like rocks and cars and chairs and tables and things that have a kind of unity to them, but they don't have souls. They're not conscious, experiencing, valuing, choosing individuals. They're extremely useful. Those chairs you are sitting in right now are extremely useful. These tables that you are writing on and holding your material on, they're extremely useful. They're good. But they're not valuable in themselves. They're not ends in themselves. They are valuable as means to end. Well, you know, anybody who studied ethics is familiar with those first two kinds of goodness. Nothing new here. Robert S. Hartman said there's a third kind of goodness that we need to recognize and try to keep track of, and if we do keep track of it, we can make a lot of progress, actually a lot. They call that systemic goodness. Systemically good things are ideas, beliefs, concepts, doctrines, rules, regulations, commandments, formalities, logic, mathematics. And he called those things systemically good. He recognized three basic kinds of goodness. In doing my work for this book, I found it necessary to identify a fourth dimension of goodness. I want to add this to the list here. Some things it seemed to me, some good things that we definitely value positively don't fall into any one of those three categories. They're things that exist inside of us, inside of our own consciousness. And because they exist only inside of us, a lot of philosophers have assumed that these things are intrinsically good. I have in mind things like pleasure, happiness, enjoyment, reason, conscience, love, compassion. Now, I call these things intrinsic value enhancers. Gotta have a label for it. And I believe these are another kind of goodness. That none of these things are valuable to themselves. None of these things value themselves or anything else. None of these things know anything. None of these things care about anything. Pleasure doesn't know anything. Pleasure as such doesn't know anything. Happiness, defined in terms of pleasure, continued pleasure over an extended period of time. Happiness doesn't value anything. It means nothing to itself. Conscience means nothing to itself. But things like that mean a lot to us. They enrich our lives as intrinsically valuable beings. So this category of being good for intrinsically valuable beings, I would want to recognize as a fourth kind or dimension of goodness. Now, there's a lot that you can do with these different kinds of tools once you have them before us. Robert S. Hartman used his three to develop extremely powerful and enlightening value profiles that are widely used in consulting, and KT Connor can tell you all about that if you want to know more about it. What I would like for us to do is to think about this. Consider the good things that are emphasized in Whitehead's philosophy. Especially, say, toward the end of Adventures of Ideas. Truth, for example. Beauty. Adventure. Peace. If we had to classify these things with respect to one of these 3 or 4 kinds or dimensions of goodness, how should we classify them? Anybody have any thoughts about that? I challenge you to think about it, but while you're thinking about it, let me just say, aesthetics has been heavily emphasized in process ethics. And I think it's a well-placed emphasis, but I think that emphasis needs a very slight modification. I do not honestly believe that beauty is intrinsically good. Now, I realize that is a heretical statement.
I'm sorry, that beauty is what?
I do not believe that beauty is intrinsically good. I believe that it is good for us. I believe that it is good because it enhances the lives, the values, the experiences of unique individuals. Like those of us who are sitting here in this room today. Many, many wonderful things are good, not in themselves, not to themselves. They don't know anything. They don't mean anything to themselves. But they're good for us. They enrich our lives and our experiences with goodness. So in all honesty, that's the way I would deal with the value of beauty. I would not treat it as intrinsically good. I would treat it as good for us, an intrinsic value enhancer, something that enriches the lives of concrete individual persons like us. One final topic I will introduce. I'm indebted to Hartman for his emphasis on human uniqueness and the way in which he expounded the very concept of human uniqueness and the way in which he linked human uniqueness to intrinsic worth. One way to grasp the significance of human uniqueness is to ask a question that for some time now has been asked and discussed in ethics. That is, if you've got a good thing, would anything of value be lost if you replaced it with something else just like it? Now, it seems to me with respect to universals, with respect to repeatable eternal objects, as we say in process law, one eternal object is just as good as another. I mean, consider, enjoyment for the moment. One bit of enjoyment. It is the same quality, and I do recognize qualities here, like Mel. One bit of enjoyment. This is the same quality and duration and intensity and origin and effects as another. It's just as good as the other. So, you can replace it without any loss of value. One new Toyota.
One you what?
One new Toyota car
Oh, okay.
with exactly the same qualities as the next new Toyota. It's just as good. Doesn't matter which one you take, you can replace one with the other. And nothing of great value will be lost. Now that works for universals. It works for eternal objects. Does it work for unique persons? Can we just replace one unique person with another without any loss of value? Seems to me the answer to that question has to be no. One criticism of hedonism, and its answer to the question of what's intrinsically good, is this. Okay, if you hold that only pleasures are intrinsically good, what kind of value is left for people? What kind of value do people have, if any, if only pleasure or happiness is intrinsically good? Well, the hedonistic answer has to be people are useful containers. They're good buckets, extrinsically good things that are worth having around so that you can have some pleasure in the universe. But otherwise, they don't have any value of their own, they're replaceable. Well, people who have looked at that criticism of hedonism have been very unhappy with the hedonistic answer to it. Because most of us, I think, when we think about it, want to say we, as conscious, unique, experiencing, acting, choosing, feeling, thinking individuals, we are valuable for our own sake and in and of ourselves, and not just as useful receptacles for holding pleasure. And of course, I wonder if process ethics gets into the same predicament if it says, and I don't think it clearly says this, but if it says that beauty is the only thing that's intrinsically good. If you put it that way, it's okay. Well, if you say beauty is the only thing that's intrinsically good, where does that leave us as unique persons? What kind of value does that leave us having? Kant's always treat persons as ends in themselves and never merely as means. And one of his books, a footnote, Fundamental Principles of Morality. He says, what I really mean by respecting persons as ends is respecting the moral law within them of which they give us an example. I'm not happy with that answer. Question?
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just noticing we only have 10 minutes, and that means if we don't have any time for conversation.
Let me say one more thing and I'll hush. When Thomas Jefferson went to France to take the place of Benjamin Franklin as our ambassador to France. Someone asked him, Mr. Jefferson, are you Mr. Franklin's replacement? And his answer was, no one can replace him, sir. I am only his successor. Thank you. Question? Comments?
William, were you raising your hand?
Sure, I'll go ahead. Thanks, Rem, for so much here and so much to agree with. So I'll go to the parts where we might push the conversation forward.
Good.
On the replaceability question, there's a great essay by Dan Dombrowski in response to Claire Palmer on the replaceability question.
Yes, in process of.
Yeah, and so I think Dan is right that a Whiteheadian position, because it argues that each achievement of value is unique, does not have the same replaceability problem that a utilitarian would, because it doesn't make a distinction between the individual and the experiences of the individual in the way that a utilitarian would. And I might go the same direction in terms of beauty. It'll probably require a longer answer, but because it's an interesting concern that I hadn't thought of, and if I am guilty of it, then that's a problem for me. But it seems that beauty for Whitehead is another way of describing aesthetic synthesis, the way that things come together. So
That's right. You do a great job of describing Hartshorne's analysis.
Yeah, and it's not that beauty for Hartshorne and for Whitehead is not the experience that I have of something that's beautiful, but beauty is the way that this is brought together in this particular way. So it is beautiful. It's a description of its unity, its harmony and intensity, right? So I think if that's the case, then that it's not, we would again make a distinction between my experience of something as beautiful and its beauty, as though I can separate them and then create a replaceability problem where the individual and its experiences are distinct. Instead, they can't be separated, I don't think, in which case I'm hoping to avoid. But it's probably a longer discussion that we need to have.
Yeah, we do need to have a long discussion on that. My response is, it seems to me that it's pretty obvious it can be separated, if for no other reason. We aren't constantly experiencing beauty, but we are constantly here.
Excuse me, I'm not
I
hearing.
mean, we aren't constantly experiencing beauty, but we are constantly here. We do constantly exist.
And in our constant existence, we have some degree of beauty.
Yeah.
That's what Whitehead would say.
Yeah.
As I take it, for instance, I take beauty as another way of trying to explain creativity. And so I see it as just another vocabulary for trying to spell out what he was already talking about as what he meant by creativity. Now that requires an argument, but
Well, it does require an argument.
and I hope I didn't just insert it in the book, but another way of getting into this is actually on your 3 or 4 kinds of goodness. Use intrinsic goodness. So I'm trying to relate what Hartman's view to Whitehead's. Intrinsic goodness everything is intrinsically good for Whitehead, right? So every achievement of
pulsation of actuality is intrinsically
good for itself, for others, and every.
But some things are
is-
just some composite enduring objects.
Well, they're not individuals, properly speaking.
Well,
right?
they're not. No, they're not individuals, but there's a place for them in process thought as aggregates.
But
they're not intrinsically good.
But anything with an end in itself, because he extends teleology farther down than Kant would, since so many other things are ends in themselves, then intrinsic goodness extends farther. And so that is one place of, I don't know if it's tension, but we want to work it out. The other, that systemic goodness, was really interesting to me. Initially, I was reading it, and I thought of Holmes Ralston uses, in his book, Environmental Ethics, uses the phrase systemic value. But for him, he's referring to the value of systems, and he thinks that you have intrinsic instrumental and systemic value, and they can't be reduced to each other, that he thinks they're these three. And so it'd be interesting to talk with you later about how, obviously this is very different, a very different
Right.
notion of systemic goodness.
Well, I think it's inclusive. I think Harmon's broader notion of systemic goodness is inclusive of that.
Oh,
sense.
okay. I'd like to chat more about that, but I don't want to dominate it. Let other people get in.
This is really a request for some help on a discussion that's going on between Les Murray and me in the social science section. And the question is Whiteheadian ethics as we experience it overly individualistic? What's the ontological status of citizenship in this ethical tradition? If your principle is so act as to make novelty and creativity possible, what does that mean about our life as individuals and members of the community? And is there support in Whitehead for taking the community side of that as seriously as the individual side? So that if we were talking about the notion of freedom, for example, there would be content to freedom in this tradition, and it would have something to do with the health of the community, which would be a good in itself. That community, in turn, anybody who was in a leadership position, for example, would be thinking about the fate of individuals and the nurturing of individuality within the community. But what's the support for taking community as an intrinsic good as well as individuality?
I think some of the people that are going to be talking this afternoon will probably have something to say about that. My own view is that I do not regard community as such as intrinsically good. I regard it as good for us. It is as good for people. I mean, we are by nature social beings. I think some philosophers tend to disregard that fact. And we are relational individuals. I think you emphasize that very clearly in your book. The kind of individuality that we have is a relational individuality. We are what we are. Again, as you were, I think, pointing out this morning, we are what we are because of our relationships with our neighbors, with God, with our enemies, with our community. But I guess my own view is that communities are very, very good things, but not intrinsically good. They're good for us. Yes.
Yes.
Should we cut
Oh, excuse me.
No.
I was just saying it was time for the break, but I'm not trying to cut. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I just thought, at some point you asked the question, should we move beyond Whitehead?
Yes.
And I think it feels like maybe in your presentation, in some ways, you moved too quickly beyond Whitehead already, because it feels to me that what the actual occasion does is it invites us to kind of tarry at a proto-ontological level before we work with the main categories of people and communities and good, to understand that differently, right? So that when we come to an idea like community, we try to understand the actual occasion as an event, as a mode of expression that is both individual and communal, and we begin to re-understand concepts like beauty and good that we understand through humanist, Eurocentric, enculturated lenses. We try to understand that through a kind of disenchanted lens, right? A proto-ontological lens. He's inviting us to re-encounter familiar ideas from a strange place, that of the actual occasion. And I think in this, it shows me a limitation of an ethics that focuses on goodness, if it's not decentered to a kind of proto-ontological place. And again, I'm thinking of Indian thought, which asserts, I'm thinking of the Four Noble Truths, that life is suffering, and the cause of this suffering is what they call trishna, the Sanskrit root for thirst or pleasure or goodness, right? That it's that actual pleasure-seeking, goodness-seeking that is the heart of suffering. And the way to remove suffering is to remove that thirst for good. So we already have a problematic notion again on good. And then that brings me to the other section that you made of that idealism, like ideas like pleasure, that they're not in relationship with us, that they're only good for us. But this seems like a very strong bifurcation between the real and the ideal, and how the way that we act and live and become in these modes of beauty, that changes what pleasure is. It changes what goodness is. It changes, it's not just there as an external that's only good for us, but that in fact there's a mutualism in the interaction between idealism and realism. So I really appreciated some of the categories you brought up, but I also feel there's a number of limitations in your application of Whitehead here.
I appreciate everything that you say. You've made so many points, I hardly know where to start.
And I regret that we don't have time to pursue those points because they are such important. Thank you very much. We're just a little bit behind time, but we still need a brief break. So let's shoot for a 3-minute break this time.
Which will be fine.
I mean, he said he would cut him off, but he let him go for a long time.
Yes, Dr. Walker, will you moderate send the various sections? I mean, are you going to moderate all
Yes.
this?
She wants you
To be more aggressive about the time.
yeah, okay.
Just so that we have 15 minutes or something to question, plus the 10-minute break.
Yeah.
Because it is, it's fair to make a point, and then I'll give them a chance to respond.
That's true, but then a lot of times would give us a chance to respond. So at the level, this is real.
Which we've already problematized beyond.